Flávio is against ending the 6 days on, 1 day off work schedule in the government plan, even though most Brazilians are in favor of the change. The program of the PL candidate does not foresee a reduction in working hours and supports expanding direct negotiation between companies and workers. In other words, for Flávio, it's that situation. You'll be at the mercy of your employer. The employer will say, either you accept it or you're out. Because that's it. That's what happens in practice. Now, for them to try to make the worker accept this, they say, no, you sit down and negotiate. What you say will be taken into account. We know it's not really like that, right? And in his government program presented when registering his candidacy. Yesterday, there was all that mess with Missão. And right after that, Brazil's electoral court accepted his candidacy registration for the PL. And along with it, there has to be the government plan. In the government plan, the end of the 6 days on, 1 day off schedule is not included. It's not. It's like I told you all. It's like this. To put an end to the 6 days on, 1 day off schedule, Lula has to win. Because if Lula doesn't win, it's not happening. In Jesus' name. Flávio won't move this forward. It's that simple. Especially because he supports it. He's part of the elite, the employers, and not the workers and the most vulnerable people who really need the state to step in and make sure there isn't so much loss for the workers, which is what Lula's government does and always tries to do, right? And by the way, the 6 days on, 1 day off schedule is still on hold to this day. But I heard that Lula had another meeting with Davi Alcolumbre, the third one, and that Lula is pressuring Davi Alcolumbre so that Davi Alcolumbre will unblock the approval of the PEC, which has already been approved in the Chamber of Deputies, about the end of the 6 days on, 1 day off schedule. And it still needs to be approved only in the Senate. And what does that mean? For every 5 days you work, you will be guaranteed 2 days off for rest without any reduction in salary. Lula is trying to see if he can get this approved. Maybe even before the elections. If not, then after, because Lula will win for the 4th time. And mark my words, Lula for the 4th time. Now, workers, let's wake up, right? Let's wake up. You have to know who you're voting for. Because if you don't, in the end, you're the one who gets hurt. And then there's no point in crying about it either. Meanwhile, Flávio Bolsonaro does a live stream with his allies and presents a plan with major spending cuts and limits on decisions by the Supreme Federal Court. This reminds me of Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro also presented his government plan, said he was going to make things happen, was going to lower the age of criminal responsibility. He was going to change a bunch of rules, was going to make guns available to everyone. Everyone would have a gun permit. He was going to make things happen. And it was all just talk, talk, talk. And almost everything Bolsonaro said he was going to do, he didn't do. Why, Andrea? Because it was unconstitutional. For you to be president, governor, mayor, for him to turn his measures into law, first of all, his measures, his projects, his program, they have to be in accordance with the Constitution. If they are not, he can't get them approved. And if by any chance he manages to get them approved, the Federal Supreme Court is called upon, and the Federal Supreme Court overturns the law, overturns what was approved. For example, I'll give you some examples. The decrees that Bolsonaro made about firearms. The first 2 measures that Bolsonaro took as soon as he was elected president, he was elected in 2018, and in 2019, he took office as president. The first 2 things he did. The first thing he did was issue firearm decrees, allowing people to carry firearms, allowing people to have access to guns. They were all struck down. And then he presented the proposed constitutional amendment on pension reform. That one was approved, whipping the backs of workers, both men and women, in Brazil. Many workers, in fact, will only find out that they will have to work more, they will receive less, and they still have to meet a minimum age to retire. And the pension reform was approved. So several measures that Bolsonaro proposed were not implemented because they weren't constitutional and were not approved. It's the same thing with Flávio. Flávio also said a lot of things, he's saying a lot of things that won't be approved simply because they're unconstitutional. Andrea, but why does a guy who's a lawyer, who knows what you're talking about, and Flávio, even so, he presents it just to sweet talk the crowd. He says, look, now it's going to happen. Look, now we are going to make it. It's just to fool the crowd. That's it. It's just to sweet talk people. Do you understand, my dear? So, like, it's more of the same and a lot of Bolsonaro in it, guys. And he said he's going to make big cuts. He's going to cut a lot of things. Where is he going to cut, Andrea? At the expense of workers, from lowest benefits, from the most needy, people with disabilities unable to work, poor people who receive lowest benefits, elderly people without any income who receive lowest, targeting Minha Casa Minha Vida and Bolsa Família, targeting programs that serve the most vulnerable people, retirees and pensioners. He's going to make across the board cuts, major cuts. Maybe he'll do what they used to say Lula had to do. Because they used to say that Lula had to freeze the minimum wage for 6 years. Do you remember that? I haven't forgotten. They had to freeze the minimum wage for 6 years. Maybe he will implement that. Who knows? Because they always said that, something even Bolsonaro didn't have the courage to do. Nevertheless, Bolsonaro, during 4 years, didn't give a single year of real increase to the minimum wage. Will Flávio do the same thing? Like father, like son. Will Flávio stop updating the income tax table like Bolsonaro did? At the end of Bolsonaro's government, those who earned a salary, those who earned less than 2 minimum wages were paying income tax. If Flávio doesn't update the income tax bracket regarding income tax exemption, what will save the worker is if Lula manages to. He managed to approve the income tax exemption for those who earn up to 5,000 reais. If not, it was a whip across workers' backs. The father did it, now the son is doing it. And it's the same thing with this government plan that he presented. He proposes a series of cuts hitting workers, retirees, and pensioners. From LOAS, from Minha Casa Minha Vida, from cotas, from social programs, and from Bolsa Família. That's what he does in his program. And I keep thinking how trabalhada dos outros quatro. But even worse, they vote, right? There are people out there bragging. They live off Bolsa Família, have a house because of the Minha Casa Minha Vida program. There are people in the family who get lowest benefits and still go vote for Flávio. Then, when everything gets cut, don't come crying. Don't cry, because we're warning you. And it's so interesting, right, that Caiado's Vaz seems to be supporting Lula. Gilberto Kassab. Ronaldo Caiado, former governor of the state of Goiás, is a pre-candidate for the presidency, and he is from the PSD. And his vice is the president of the PSD, Gilberto Kassab. And Gilberto Kassab made a very interesting statement. Look at his statement here. Kassab says that the Centrão is with Lula, and that Flávio Bolsonaro's chances of being elected are 0. Wow. I don't understand anything anymore. Even Caiado's Vice seems to be supporting Lula with what she's saying here. Look. He said that Flávio's chances of winning are 0. That the left is with Lula and the center is with Lula. And we know that some part of the right is also with Lula, who won't vote for the pain in the neck Flávio Bolsonaro. So, it's really interesting, right, guys? It's the kind of thing that makes you stop and say, wait, but André, I don't understand anything anymore. And me? Do you think I understand? Do you think I understand any of this? And not even political science can explain this. But actually it does, right? Actually, Gilberto Kassab knows. He is, right? He's trying soon, right? Soon to see if he gets a few votes, to see if he can land a cabinet post in Lula's government later, you know? Yeah, guys. Yeah, for God's sake. As my grandmother used to say, for God's sake. That's pretty much it, guys. Oh, Jesus. And yesterday it was really nice, and I think it was even necessary there in the plenary session of the Federal Supreme Court. There were some explanations and some statements about the various lies, fake news, and misinformation that, in fact, Flávio was one of the people spreading, trying to turn the press against Minister Alexandre de Moraes because of that search and seizure order that Minister Alexandre de Moraes authorized against Raimundo Cotrim, who was and had been journalist Pablo's source, who published on his blog a series of claims alleging that Flávio Dino was committing corrupt acts for using official cars for personal purposes, right? Then a bunch of uninformed people, stupid and others acting in bad faith, saying that Minister Alexandre de Moraes was violating journalist source confidentiality, which is the right that the press has, freedom of the press, and so on. I was one of the first to say, guys, that's not it. We're not working here to break anyone's confidentiality or reveal anyone's source. The journalist wasn't forced to reveal their source. Everything is fine. That doesn't take away the police's duty and authority to investigate if there's suspicion of crimes. Then, yesterday, the Supreme Federal Court justices spoke. Edson Fachin expressed his solidarity with Minister Flávio Dino, and he was being harassed, followed, threatened, he and his family. And that's why he used an official armored car, which was actually requested by the federal police for him with the approval of the Attorney General. So there was nothing wrong with that. But then, who was following Flávio Dino, threatening him, and causing the whole situation? That's the point. The federal police suspects that it was actually Raimundo Cotrim himself who was doing that. He started to chase Flávio Dino, threaten him, and so on, follow him, and he himself passed this information to the journalist. So there is no issue of breaking the confidentiality of the press source, right? Nothing like that. What is being done is an investigation specifically about this. Because, according to documents from the Supreme Federal Court, it is a criminal organization. And this Raimundo, he is even being investigated for the murder of a businessman in 2022. And this businessman, who was murdered in 2022, in which Raimundo is under investigation before the Federal Supreme Court, whose rapporteur is Minister Alexandre de Moraes. It could have been a killing to silence him, because this businessman also appeared in the investigations, in the inquiry that is under André Mendonça about the INSS fraud. It could be a killing to silence him. The murder of this businessman, in which this Raimundo is one of the suspects. In fact, André Mendonça went to Flávio Dino and said, look, Flávio Dino, this has to do with what's happening to you and your family. Be careful. And he passed it on to him. And all of this ended up in the hands of Alexandre de Moraes. Why? Because Alexandre de Moraes is the rapporteur of this murder investigation that's involved or not involved. But this Raimundo Cotrim, former federal police commissioner, is a suspect. Do you understand, my dear? So it has nothing to do with it. Then Flávio was one of the first to come out publicly and speak and try to incite the press against Minister Alexandre de Moraes because of his decision ordering a search and seizure against Raimundo. Who was the journalist's source? I repeat, the journalist was never required to reveal their source. The rights of the press were preserved, but that does not remove or exclude the police's duty and authority to investigate suspicions of crimes and serious offenses. Do you understand? Do you understand, my dear? Now, let's take a look at some things from Flávio Dino. Let's see what Flávio Dino said yesterday at the Federal Supreme Court about the situation here. Pay attention and say it. Flávio Dino is right.
I appreciate Your Excellency's statement on behalf of the court, which puts the facts back on the right track in two ways. The first is related to the legitimate investigation of hypothetical crimes. The other is the protection that exists and will always exist for the regular practice of the profession, and not obviously to any possible co-authorship of crimes. But of course, as Your Excellency said, the panel will rule on it. But certainly with care, our case law protecting freedom of the press, which is nearly a century old, in the darkness of the military dictatorship, one of the reasons for the abject removal of 3 members of this panel was exactly decisions in favor of freedom of the press. The history of the court records this, especially between the years 1965 and 1968, when the darkness became even denser. With the issuance of Institutional Act number 5 on December 13, 1968. So, few can give lessons to the Supreme Court about freedom of the press in light of this traditional line of jurisprudence.
I want to pause here because this was a message for Rede Globo, because Rede Globo, especially the journalist Malu Gaspar, was one of the main ones who harshly criticized, saying that the dictatorship was coming back. I don't know what, echoing what the Bolsonaro supporters were saying and what Flávio Bolsonaro also said. That's why Flávio Diniz here is sending the message. One thing is one thing, another thing is another thing. Let's let him continue here. Look.
Of which Your Excellency, I and all our colleagues are guardians. President, with this note of gratitude, especially for my family, who have nothing to do with the exercise of public duties, and therefore must be respected and protected. Something that some people seem to forget. I focus on what really matters, which is carrying out my role. Always with restraint and courage, a lot of courage. I thank Your Excellency for your statement.
Well, the message was delivered, and this statement by Flávio Dino happened because the president of the Supreme Federal Court, Edson Fachin, expressed his solidarity with Minister Flávio Dino regarding this situation. And he also said that this will be analyzed by the plenary of the Supreme Federal Court. What, André? Minister Alexandre de Moraes' decision for search and seizure regarding Raimundo Putrin, and it's extremely important that this is analyzed by the plenary. To clear up any doubts about the situation regarding some journalists who are criminals. Unfortunately, there are criminals everywhere, folks. There are criminals in every profession, including in the field of journalism. Do you understand? And we can't mix things up. And let's listen to what Justice Edson Fachin said so we can make it clear what he said. And it will be very important that this request be considered by the full court to put an end once and for all to this nonsense from people saying that Brazil is returning to a dictatorship, when in fact, they are the ones who want to impose criminality without any state reprimand, which is absurd. Let's see here.
Expresses solidarity with Justice Flávio Dino and acknowledges that threats to the physical safety of justices and their families must be thoroughly investigated. The Judicial Police Department of the Federal Supreme Court will cooperate with public authorities to fully clarify the facts and for holding accountable, including criminally, those who have committed crimes. The Federal Supreme Court, at the same time as it should, reaffirms its commitment and adherence to the Constitution and to respecting fundamental freedoms, especially with freedom of the press and with the fundamental right of journalists to protect their sources. Over the years, the Supreme Court's jurisprudence has emphasized, as it should, under the aegis of the 1988 Constitution, the primacy that these rights have within the legal framework. The court's jurisprudence will remain intact and binding on everyone. The bodies of the judiciary and their justices have not strayed and will not stray from their commitment to these rights. The investigation of any possible offenses must be directed at, and will certainly be directed at, the conduct that is the subject of the investigation. Never will legitimate journalistic activity carried out in the fulfillment of its function, such as investigation, be the target of that. That's it.
And he said that this should be evaluated, Minister Alexandre de Moraes' decision, by the plenary. That's absolutely correct. Now, we also need to hear from Alexandre de Moraes as well. Let's see. Alexandre de Moraes makes it very clear that this has nothing to do with breaking source confidentiality. Here, we are talking about crime, about a criminal organization. That's what is being investigated. And the source's confidentiality was preserved. Why? Because the journalist was not forced to reveal who their source was. So this right of the press or the journalist was not violated. And the rest is just whining. Maybe even defending criminals. Pay attention here, very interesting.
Mr. President, first of all, I want to begin by congratulating Your Excellency, President Edson Fachin, and for the words of solidarity with Minister Flávio Dino. And more than that, to his whole family, his wife Dania, his children, yes, whose safety, Mr. President, whose safety was put at real risk by a criminal organization, a criminal association, as pointed out both by the federal police and by the Office of the Prosecutor General. It is the blatant commission of several crimes that are being investigated, including the crime of stalking as provided in Article 147A of the Penal Code. Both the report from the federal police and the opinion from the Office of the Prosecutor General indicated clear evidence of materiality and strong concrete indications of criminal authorship. Criminal conduct by the suspects, whether they are lawyers or journalists, mainly pointing out, and this is the most important, shared criminal intent between the perpetrators of the criminal offenses, including the transfer of money between them, that is, with money being transferred for the purpose of spreading criminal information.
Then you ask me like this. Yeah, Andrea, what is this so-called objective link that he mentioned between the parties? It's the agreement. The clear intention to reach that result. Between whom? Between those involved, between the journalist and the source. He even said that there was payment. There was a payment of 100,000 reais to the journalist through a lawyer who is connected to the source. In other words, very possibly, the source, who is suspected of harassing and threatening Flávio Dino's family, did this, took this information, gave it to the journalist, and even paid the journalist to publish it. Trying to question the honor and honesty of Minister Flávio Dino, saying that he was using official vehicles for private matters, which would be a kind of act of corruption. That's the situation here. But it's even more serious than that. Let's continue here. So the objective link is this. It's the direct connection between them, with the goal of achieving result X, including payment. So there's no saint here. Like I said, there are criminals everywhere, even among journalists. Let's continue here so we can understand all of this, because this is an injustice that we cannot accept.
Obtained. In this federal Supreme Court, as Minister Flávio Dino highlighted, the court defended freedom of the press during the harsh times of the dictatorship. The court continues to defend and will always defend freedom of the press, the free practice of journalism, and all its rights and guarantees, including source confidentiality. Source confidentiality, which is a constitutional guarantee, constitutional, enshrined by this Supreme Court, but which has never been and will never be confused with a shield for carrying out illegal activities. Source confidentiality, which is an essential guarantee for the defense of democracy and not a hidden instrument for criminal associations to commit various criminal offenses with impunity. The press is serious in Brazil. Journalists act in good faith and know this. They know that one thing is source confidentiality. Another thing is criminal activity against either authorities or members of society. Let's not confuse investigative journalists with journalists being investigated for criminal activities. Yes, Mr. President, first of all, I would like to...
That's right. Alexandre de Moraes really has to take action. And we have to make all of this very clear, because here there are mainly two ministers involved who deserve our respect. Minister Alexandre de Moraes and Minister Flávio Dino. That's why from the beginning I brought this up. I explained this to you from the start, and I was really delighted when I saw that they decided yesterday in the plenary to talk about this, because it was necessary to clarify things even more for the public, so they wouldn't be fooled and end up looking like the ones in the wrong. So that's why I say Flávio Dino is right. Alexandre de Moraes is going all in. Now, we can't ignore Minister Flávio Dino's account talking about some situations, about this episode of persecution against his family. And these are very serious situations that cannot be normalized. And these people must be held accountable, no matter who they are. Whether they are a lawyer, a journalist, a worker, whoever it is. If they did something wrong, they have to pay for what they did. Pay attention.
A topic that is especially precious to the history of the court regarding the protection of freedoms, as Your Excellency alluded to. It's curious that before me there was only one Supreme Court justice who was followed and had his family followed. Only before me. It was again during the long, long night of the dictatorship. Therefore, I am the second. During the dictatorship, I always refer to the dictatorship for a reason. There are people who have blood on their hands from torture, who have the blood of those who are victims of that despotic regime on their hands. And suddenly, without any retraction, they want to lecture the Supreme Court about freedom. We need to have humility. Public debate requires this historical understanding so that all of us can preserve the set of constitutional values. Freedom of the press, source confidentiality, judicial independence, which obviously cannot be subject to intimidation. Imagine, Minister Castro, you are a father, Your Excellency, even if you are not having photos of your children exposed. As a kind of message, maybe, look, we know who they are, where they go, how they get around. So I appreciate Minister Alexandre's solidarity, just as I appreciated Minister Fachin's, especially for this reason. Where I come from, I'm used to public debate. Unfortunately, being a judge doesn't allow me to do it the way I'd like, the way I learned. But in this case, obviously, I thank both the President and the Vice President who spoke on behalf of the court.
Well, just so you know, Flávio Dino's children were being followed and photos were taken of them and sent to him. Like this. I know where your son goes. Your son goes to judo. Your daughter does this, that. I know the routine. I know everything. And they would send it to him. What was that for, André? To cause terror. To cause fear and terror in the minister. For what, André? To stop him. To stop him. So that he would stop doing the work he was doing. To go after, like he did and is doing, the legislative earmarks. To go after the criminals. To go after the excessive public sector salaries. To go after the perks, the so-called compulsory retirement. To go after the coup plotters, the whole situation. It was terror to see if it would stop Flávio Dino. So, like, We have to speak up and we have to show that Flávio Dino deserves our respect, and so does Minister Alexandre de Moraes, okay? And here's what he said. I want to read this statement from Minister Flávio Dino that he posted on his social media. He said, "As I have already had the opportunity to clarify, my role as a judge prevents me from participating daily in passionate public debates. This includes silently enduring attacks and injustices, witnessing monumental distortions of facts, and watching in bewilderment as absurd interpretations are presented. In other roles, I could speak out openly, more often. Now, that can still happen, but only in very exceptional cases. It's part of the burden of my profession. And I gladly take on that burden given the responsibility with which I exercise my jurisdiction. And in any case, my life story and my professional record over 37 years of public service are my greatest defense." Why is he saying this here? Because ministers and judges can't go around making statements, right, Andre? No, they can't. Judges and ministers have to lead a reserved, private, more closed off life. They can't be giving interviews in any situation, talking and debating. They just can't. And he's saying that before, as a politician, he could. And he used to confront, he used to explain, and he used to speak. But now he can't. Now he's seeing interpretations, he's seeing absurd statements, and he can't respond. Except, exceptionally, like what happened yesterday, with those very important and necessary explanations in this case. See, my dear, I'm with Flávio Dino, I'm with Alexandre de Moraes, and you? And it's interesting that there are people who say a good criminal is a dead criminal. But in this case, they're defending criminals. Why? Because they want to attack Alexandre de Moraes and Flávio Dino. So, like it's so much hypocrisy, it's so much nonsense. I'm with Flávio Dino and Alexandre de Moraes. And you? Bye, see you later.